Justice in its simplest form means to set things right. We are called to take action and confront evil, to care for the vulnerable, and to make right that which is wrong. Social justice involves promoting a just society by challenging injustice and valuing diversity. Social justice focuses on addressing injustices in society. And if we have experienced freedom, how can we not pursue freedom on behalf of others? Yet, it's not about picking up yet another cause because it sounds appealing and makes us look good. Pursuing justice starts and continues with a foundation of thought, time, and sacrifice. It means stepping out of our comfort zone and persevering with patience. It means walking in wisdom and taking action wisely. You must stand up against justice. We all must stand up against justice and love others with our words and our actions.
Throughout history, the human voice has always been a powerful catalyst for change. Many speeches can motivate people to do better and be better. But then there are those speeches that inspire millions and even change the course of history. Today, we'll be sharing excerpts from 6 such speeches that have changed the world. And we'll be starting with Emmeline Pankhurst's 1913 speech, Freedom or Death.
Emmeline Pankhurst was a British suffragette, which means she fought for women's voting rights. This speech is from 1913. She was in Hartford, Connecticut, and was speaking to them. She says, "I am here as a soldier who has temporarily left the field of battle to explain what civil war is like when civil war is waged by women. According to the courts of my country, I am of no value to my community at all. I am adjudged to be a dangerous person under sentence of servitude in a convict prison. If I were a man and I said to you, I come from a country which professes to have representative institutions and yet denies me representative rights, you would then understand that a man was justified in the adoption of revolutionary methods. But since I'm a woman, it is necessary in the 20th century to explain why women have adopted revolutionary methods in order to win the rights of citizenship. Suppose the men of Hartford had a grievance and they went to their legislature and the legislature refused to listen. What would be the proper way of getting their grievance removed? Well, at the next general election, the men of Hartford would vote out that legislature. But let the men of Hartford imagine that they were not in the position of being voters. What would the men of Hartford do then? They couldn't vote the legislature out. They would have to choose. They would either have to submit to an unjust state of affairs or they would have to rise up. We know what happened. They laid their arguments before the British government, and when their arguments were disregarded, they held the Tea Party at Boston, and they went on to win the independence of the United States of America. Our actions were not militant, except that they provoked militancy on the part of the opposition. When women asked questions in political meetings, they were not doing anything militant. No man was ever put out of a public meeting for asking a question until votes for women came up. We found that all the phrases about freedom and liberty were entirely for male consumption. When it was said, taxation without representation is tyranny, everyone quite calmly accepted the fact that women had to go on paying taxes. We found that government of the people, by the people, and for the people was again only for male consumption. In fact, almost every principle of liberty enunciated in any civilized country on earth was intended entirely for men. Like our methods or not, we have made women's suffrage one of the questions which cannot be neglected. No other method than ours would have brought about that result. We have brought pressure to bear upon the government to compel them to deal with women's suffrage. People had to realize that women wanted to vote and that things were going to be very uncomfortable until women got the vote. because it is not by making people comfortable that you get things in life. It is by making them uncomfortable. You have two babies, very hungry and wanting to be fed. One baby is a patient baby and waits until its mother is ready to feed it. The other baby is an impatient baby and cries until it's fed. We know perfectly well which baby is attended to first. That is the whole history of politics. I am always proud to think that two American girls, Miss Lucy Burns and Miss Alice Paul, served their suffrage apprenticeship in the militant ranks in England. One of them was thrown into prison. They would not be degraded by wearing prison clothes, and they adopted the hunger strike as a protest against the criminal treatment. Well, then it was that women began to withhold their consent. We have brought the government of England to this position. Either women are to be killed or women are to have the vote. I asked American men in this meeting, what would you say if you were faced with that alternative? That you must either kill them or give them their citizenship. Women, many of whom you respect, there is only one answer. You must give women the vote. So here I am. I've come after having been 4 times in prison, probably going back to be rearrested as soon as I set my foot on British soil. I've come to ask you to help to win this fight. If we win it in the future, it is going to be easier for women all over the world to win their fight when their time comes. Thank you.
As Eleanor Roosevelt might have said, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this service on the great moments in social justice history. I am honored to be included, but am unconvinced that my words are worthy of such praise. As a cradle roll Episcopalian, the gospel as presented by Jesus of Nazareth has been the foundation of my commitment to human rights and freedom. In 2 words, social justice. After my husband Franklin died, I was no longer needed to fill any official government function. Yet I was urged to assume some role which I felt committed. As a delegate to the new United Nations and as chairman of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I was able to continue my commitment to human rights and freedom for all people. Since no nation has achieved all of these goals set forth in this document, it is best called a declaration to help us all remember it is a work in progress. What follows is a few of the remarks that I gave at the Sorbonne in France. It was here that the Declaration of the Rights of Man was proclaimed, and the great slogans of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, fired the imagination of men. It seems to me there is valid reason for taking time today to think carefully and clearly on the subject of human rights, because in the acceptance and observance of these rights lies the root, I believe, of our chance of peace in the future, and for the strengthening of the United Nations organizations to the point where it can maintain peace in the future. We must not be confused about what freedom is. Basic human rights are simple and easily understood. Freedom of speech and free press, freedom of religion and worship, freedom of assembly and the right of petition, the right of men to be secure in their homes and free from unreasonable search and seizure, from arbitrary arrest and punishment. We must not be deluded by the efforts of the forces of reaction to prostitute the great words of our free tradition and thereby confuse the struggle. Democracy, freedom, human rights have come to have definite meanings to the people of the world, which we must not allow any nation to so change that they are made synonymous with suppression and dictatorship. The final expression of the opinion of the people with us is through free and honest elections and valid choices on basic issues and candidates. The secret ballot is an essential to free elections. I have heard my husband say many times that a people need never fear lose their freedom if they keep their right to a secret ballot and if they use that secret ballot to the full. In the United States, we are old enough to claim perfection. We recognize that we have some problems of discrimination, but we find steady progress being made in the solution of these problems. Through normal democratic processes, we are coming to understand our needs and how we can attain full equality for all our people. It is my belief, and I am sure it is yours also, that the struggle for democracy and freedom is a critical struggle, for their preservation is essential to the great objective of the United Nations to maintain international peace and security. Among free men, the end cannot justify the means. The United States must hold fast to the heritage of freedom won by the struggle of its people. It must help us to pass it on to generations to come. It is now, as always, our hope that despite the wide differences in approach we face in the world today, we can, with mutual good faith in the principles of the United Nations Charter, arrive at a common basis of understanding. As one of the delegates from the United States, I pray Almighty God that we may win another victory here for the rights and freedoms of all men. Thank you.
During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination and I have fought against Black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. These are the words of Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, 1950 to 1963, who is known for advancing equality and justice. The following is an excerpt from Macmillan's Winds of Change, a speech delivered on February 3rd, 1960, to both houses of Parliament of the Union of South Africa in Cape Town. Reflecting on changes at the end of World War II, Macmillan said this: "Since the end of the war, the processes which gave birth to the nation states of Europe have been repeated all over the world. We have seen the awakening of national consciousness in peoples who have for centuries lived in dependence upon some other power. In different places, it takes different forms, but it is happening everywhere. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. As I see it, the great issue in this second half of the 20th century is whether the uncommitted peoples of Asia and Africa will swing to the east or to the west. Will they be drawn into the communist camp, or will the great experiments in self-government that are now being made in Asia and Africa prove so successful, and by their example so compelling, that the balance will come down in favor of freedom and order and justice? This experience of our own explains why it has been our aim in the countries for which we have borne responsibility, not only to raise the material standards of living, but also to create a society which respects the rights of individuals, a society in which men are given the opportunity to grow to their full stature. And that must, in our view, include the opportunity to have an increasing share in political power and responsibility." Thank you.
We're all familiar with Martin Luther King's the latter part of his historical I Have a Dream speech in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but I had not focused before on his opening words, which are very profound to me. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise to all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the, quote, unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of colors are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. There is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. Thank you.
In June 1964, Nelson Mandela was convicted of sabotage for his role as an African National Congress activist against the former apartheid regime of South Africa and sentenced to life in prison. Mandela had been accused of inciting strikes by workers and leaving the country without permission of the government. During his trial, facing a possible death sentence, Mandela made a speech in the courtroom. Instead of testifying in his own defense, Mandela spoke from the dock for more than 3 hours. That speech, which later became known as the Rivonia speech, is one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. And this is an excerpt from that speech. Our fight is against real and not imaginary hardships, or to use the language of the state prosecutor, so-called hardships. Basically, my lord, we fight against two features which are the hallmarks of African life in South Africa and which are entrenched by legislation which we seek to have repealed. These features are poverty and lack of human dignity, and we do not need communists or so-called agitators to teach us about these things. Africans want to be paid a living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing, and not work which the government declares them to be capable of. We want to be allowed to live where we obtain work and not be endorsed out of an area because we were not born there. We want to be allowed and not obliged to live in rented houses, which we can never call our own. We want to be a part of the general population and not confined to living in our ghettos. African men want to have their wives and children to live with them where they work and not to be forced into unnatural existence in men's hostels. Our women want to be with their menfolk and not to be left permanently widowed in the reserves. We want to be allowed out after 11 o'clock at night and not to be confined to our rooms like little children. We want to be allowed to travel in our own country and to seek work where we want to, not where the Labor Bureau tells us to. We want a just share in the whole of South Africa. We want security and a stake in society. Above all, we want equal political rights, because without them, our disabilities will be permanent. I know this sounds revolutionary to the whites in this country, because the majority of voters will be Africans. This makes the white man fear democracy. But this fear cannot be allowed to stand in the way of the only solution which will guarantee racial harmony and freedom for all. It is not true that the enfranchisement of all will result in racial domination. Political division based on color is entirely artificial, and when it disappears, so will the domination of one color group by another. The ANC has spent half a century fighting against racialism. When it triumphs, as it certainly must, it will not change that policy. This then is what the ANC is fighting. Our struggle is a truly national one. It is a struggle of the African people inspired by our own suffering and our own experience. It is a struggle for the right to live. During my lifetime, I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against Black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Thank you.
Elie Wiesel comes from the Orthodox Jewish tradition. He is a Romanian Holocaust survivor, an author, and an activist. Excerpted are parts of the speech he delivered in 1986 upon accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, and again in 1999 to President and Mrs. Clinton. Let's listen to his words. 41 years ago, a young Jewish boy woke up in a place called Buchenwald. He was finally free, but there was no joy in his heart. He thought there never would be again. Liberated a day earlier by American soldiers, he remembers their rage at what they saw. Though he did not understand their language, their eyes told him what he needed to know, that they too would remember and bear witness. In the ghettos and the death camps, we felt that to be abandoned by God was worse than to be punished by him. Better an unjust God than an indifferent one. For us to be ignored by God was a harsher punishment than to be a victim of his anger. During the darkest of times, we felt abandoned, forgotten. And our only miserable consolation was that we believed that the leaders of the free world did not know what was going on behind those black gates and barbed wire. If they knew, we thought, surely those leaders would have been moved with heaven and earth to intervene. They would have spoken out with great courage and outrage and conviction. And we discovered that the Pentagon knew, the State Department knew, and the president knew. A ship with its human cargo of 1,000 people was turned back to Nazi Germany from America, the greatest democracy. Have we learned from the past, from our experiences? Has society changed? Are we less sensitive to the plight of victims of injustices in places near and far? Why the indifference on the highest level to the suffering of victims? So what is indifference? A strange and unnatural state which blurs light and darkness, dusk and dawn, crime and punishment, cruelty and compassion, good and evil. Is it necessary at times to practice it simply to keep one's sanity, live normally as the world around us experiences harrowing upheavals? Indifference can be tempting, even seductive. It is so much easier to look away from victims. It is so much easier to avoid such rude interruptions to our work, our dreams, our hopes. It is, after all, awkward, troublesome to be involved in another person's pain and despair. Yet, for the person who is indifferent, their neighbors are of no consequence, rendering their lives meaningless. Their hidden or even visible anguish is of no interest. Indifference reduces the other to an abstraction. In a way, to be indifferent to that suffering is what makes the human being inhuman. Indifference, after all, is more dangerous than anger and hatred. Anger at times can motivate one to act for the sake of humanity. Anger at the injustice that one witnesses. But indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always a friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. Indifference, then, is not only a sin, it is a punishment. Thank you.